What's up, people? We're entering into the last module of the year. Super exciting. So for this one, I just want to kind of go from the Persian Gulf War, or what's sometimes called Operation Desert Storm, even though it's part of a wider conflict, to Operation Iraqi Freedom, or the Second War in Iraq, or the invasion of Iraq, depending on what source of information you go with. There's various different names for it. So just kind of go over the highlights of that, because that's something that's still impacting your life today. It has historical roots and also will impact how we look at these things in the future as well. So without further ado, here we go. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I know that we did the 80s and 90s, and part of the 90s module was the Persian Gulf War and some information on that. But just to kind of recap and give some context, I included in there, that's Saddam Hussein over there, who was the leading authoritarian regime commander of Iraq for many decades. But the U.S. originally supported the Ba'athist Party, which is where Saddam Hussein came from. Saddam Hussein eventually became the dictator, but he wasn't the original Ba'athist leader in Iraq. So they originally supported him when he took control of Iraq from its Islamic government that it had. They saw it as they were very leery of sectarian and Islamic, especially, regimes taking power. Also the fear of communist influence in the region as well, and so they kind of saw Saddam Hussein, or the Ba'athist Party, and eventually Saddam Hussein, as being more stable, as being a nationalist type of leader in Iraq. They also supported Hussein in his war against Iran in 1982. In case you forgot, you've got the Iranian coup in the 50s, and then you've got the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979. So by 1982, the U.S. sees a potential ally, or at least an enemy of their enemy, which made them their friend, of Iran. So Iraq went to war with Iran, kind of ended up, to be honest, fairly inconsequential in terms of territory exchange or anything like that, but he did support, or the U.S. did support Hussein in that. So they're kind of started out as reluctant kind of allies or friendly towards one another. However, that changed in 1990 when Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait because of a deal they had on oil fields, and Iraq invaded them, small country, oil-rich country, and in November 1990, the UN Security Council gave Iraq a deadline to withdraw its troops, which they did not abide by. So this was another example, similarly, I guess, to the Korean War, where you have the U.S. kind of leading these UN delegations and UN foreign policy and military. But they gave them some time to get out of there. They didn't do it, so now the UN either has to step down or take action. So from January 16th to April 11th, 1992, you have this thing called Operation Desert Storm, which was also in combination with something called Operation Desert Shield, which was a little bit different. That was more of a defensive measure against some other countries, or to support some other countries. But the UN troops, led by the U.S., similar to the Korean War, like I said, liberated Kuwait from the Iraqi invasion, and Kuwait was officially freed actually in February 27th of 1992. So Iraq left, they retreated, they went back to Baghdad, and then there was this big question of whether or not the UN troops, led by the U.S., would pursue the Iraqi troops into Iraq and then eventually liberate Iraq as well. And that was something they decided not to do, because President Bush and the UN were committed to a limited war at that time. They had limited aims. Their goal was to get Kuwait liberated from the Iraqi invasion, and that was it, and they stopped and they went home, and people praised them for that at the time. Looking back, some people feel like, based on what happened in 2003, as we'll get to in a second, that was a mistake, and they should have demanded the resignation or overthrow of Saddam Hussein. So there's a couple different results from this. There was a no-fly zone, military no-fly zone instituted over Iraq for the next decade or so. Iraq would be subject to UN weapons inspections. So during the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein and the regime used chemical weapons against Iran and then also against their own citizens when there was insurrections as well. And he had to get rid of all of those and then be subject to UN weapons inspection. So the thought was that he had gotten rid of the chemical weapons, or WMDs, weapons of mass destruction as they end up calling them, and was subject to those UN weapons inspections. Hussein was allowed to remain in power, but Iraq was allowed to keep its military. So again, staying true to this idea of limited war, not overstepping bounds, not calling for the ousting of a ruler, but just accomplishing the objective and going home. So the U.S. troops, the U.S. maintained a troop footing in a variety of different places around the Persian Gulf. So it's Middle East, very oil-rich area. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, all these places that were majority Muslim countries, very oil-rich, and a lot of the time, especially with some more fundamentalist groups, like eventually Al-Qaeda, kind of resented the U.S. being there. And if you have not read the speech by Osama bin Laden in 1998, he talks about how there's infidels or these U.S. troops that are in the Persian Gulf area and how that upsets them, and they feel like is disrespectful to the point that they're willing to go to war over it. So that's the end of Operation Desert Storm. So that's different from Operation Iraqi Freedom. So when I was a kid, I knew that kind of Desert Storm had happened, and the U.S., like in third grade, I knew the U.S. like went in and kicked this bad guy out and all that stuff. And then when I got to middle school and high school, you started hearing more things about Saddam Hussein over that time. And finally, when George W. Bush comes to power it sounds like a dictator. I apologize. When he was elected in 2000, there's kind of a push inside his administration to think about how they're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This was kind of like this thorn in the U.S. side. There was like death threats towards President Bush's father after Operation Desert Storm, and the journalists generally say that George W. Bush was kind of upset about that and never kind of let that go. There's a variety of things. It's a super interesting topic in terms of its intricacies of like all the backroom things that were going on, but I'm not going to get into it here because you probably don't want to sit here and listen to me meander about anecdotes. So anyway, issues in Iraq were always in the back of the U.S. leaders' minds, to oversimplify that, after Operation Desert Storm. And Hussein began barring UN inspectors from checking for weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, in Iraq. He wouldn't let them in anymore, so they could come and look around. And his argument was that he got fed up with it, and it was violating their sovereignty as a nation. To a lot of people, they felt like that was evidence that he was hiding something and that he had weapons of mass destruction. And the George W. Bush administration really was going through a lot of effort to try to prove or find evidence that he had access to these weapons of mass destruction. And it never really actually came to pass, but they felt like since they were doing this, that this was like he was making these weapons. So actually, by the time that the U.S. invaded, he had actually started to allow the UN weapons inspectors to come back in. But in March 2003, basically what happened was President Bush gave like a international address saying that he was giving Saddam Hussein and his sons 24 hours to get out of Iraq, or the U.S. was going to come in and get him. And Hussein did not abide by this. So in March 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, and their intent was overthrowing Saddam Hussein. And their grand strategy, as we talk about in the military, was in like military science, like what is their overall political objective? It was destroying Iraqi armed forces and WMD in their possession. So they want to find the weapons of mass destruction and get rid of it, and then also displace Saddam Hussein. And it didn't take too long, only about a month, and Hussein had been overthrown. He went into hiding. But one of the big problems from a foreign policy and military perspective is that they didn't have what's called a real Phase 4 operation. Phase 4, I can't remember off the top of my head what all the phases are. Phase 3 is generally like your military engagement, and then Phase 4 is in military thinking is once you've accomplished your objective, what are you going to do? like, are you leaving at that point? Are you going to stay? Are you going to try to rebuild? So like, what is the end goal once you've accomplished your initial military objective? And what they found after kind of investigating the policymakers on this is that there wasn't really one. They weren't really sure what they were going to do, and they accomplished their goal so fast that then they were kind of left with this, like, what do we do now? We've just overthrown a authoritarian government that's been in power for, decades. Do we just like say, okay, thanks, bye, and then leave, or do we have an obligation to try to help reestablish some kind of semblance of democracy here? And they didn't really have a way for doing that. So we'll get to that in a second, but here's just a couple major operations of Iraqi freedom. So they called it Cobra II because it was supposed to be the quote-unquote sequel to the 1944 Normandy invasion. That's how, like, the people that were designing this operation thought of it. It was a simultaneous air-ground attack in order to capture Baghdad, and one term for it's called a thunder run, where they just pretty much just bombarded the capital Baghdad and just raced into the capital city from outside as fast as they could, just with a huge, basically blitz attack. And it was successful. It only took 28 days for them to get in there and for Saddam Hussein to leave. There's a picture, I think you see a couple slides, where they were pulling, the citizens of Iraq were pulling down the statue of Saddam Hussein. They were happy that this had happened. So after that, what they tried to do is they divided Iraq into 3 operational zones. So there's the north, which was assaulted from 3 directions, from Turkey in the northeast, and then helicopters from the southwestern desert. There was the south, which actually the British were one of the only countries that helped America in this endeavor. Their first armored divisions focused on taking control of the oil fields, and then in Baghdad you had the U.S. Army Corps that was there. So the special forces also were tasked with looking for the actual evidence of WMD sites. So while all this was going on and they were taking over the government and the capital, they were also looking for evidence that these weapons were there. So on May 1st, 2003, just a couple months later, President George W. Bush, and this is the big thing, and sometimes he gets criticized for this, even though he didn't say mission accomplished, but he gave this speech on this aircraft carrier, and behind him there's this sign that said mission accomplished, and he announced that all the major combat operations in Iraq had ended, and now we're moving into, again, what they call the phase 4, where you're going to have the rebuilding, or the creation of a new government in Iraq. In December 2003, Saddam Hussein was found captured in an underground hideout. I remember very clearly when the news footage, when this happened, they were basically pulled him out of a hole in the ground. It was pretty insane. And he was put in prison, eventually sentenced to death for war crimes. And Iraq was reformed into a democratic government. However, there were a variety of problems that occurred after this. Sorry about that, I clicked forward too far. So there was actually an insurgency that occurred and is still occurring relatively right now. But from a military standpoint, Operation Iraqi Freedom was a major success. They accomplished their objective that they wanted to do. They ousted the leader, took control of the capital, basically on all fronts of their 3 zones. They were successful, but from a foreign policy standard or diplomacy, there were a lot of failures. So the first thing that they wanted to institute, and they took a really hard line on this, was the de-Baathification of the Iraqi government. And what that means is they wanted all the members of the Ba'athist Party, that was Saddam Hussein's political party, to be out of the government and gone. And what happened was that got rid of nearly all of the people that had political experience in the country. And now you had the only people that were allowed to be in the government were people that either had no political experience or people that were always in a really big minority and didn't have a lot of control anyway. So kind of setting themselves up for a little bit of difficulty there in establishing a new government when you don't have anybody that has experience politically. They also disbanded the entire military and said that the Iraqi military is done. We're going to restart with a new military eventually. But what happened was you got a lot of people that have special weapons training and a lot of experience in military operations that now have no job and are kind of upset with this foreign military that came in and then overthrew them, basically. So you got a couple foreshadowings of some issues. So there was an insurgency, which is basically like the people in Iraq going against the U.S. troops that were there, that began very shortly after American occupation. So very shortly after Saddam Hussein was out of power, and the U.S. declares like this quote unquote victory, you start to have this insurgency, and it comes from various different places. So there were Shia militants, so members of the who practice Shia Islam that created this these various militant groups that were there to kind of like get rid of what they saw as foreign invaders, and also to fight against some of the Sunni militia. Iraq is a mostly Shia country, but there were Sunni militants as well. There was also this group that formed called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I put an asterisk by them because they eventually go through a little bit of a metamorphosis and change their name, but they start kind of as an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, which was the group that orchestrated the 9/11 attacks, start to try to basically just kill as many Americans as they possibly can and make the Americans disembark on what they were trying to do. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq eventually shifts its attention not only in Iraq but into Syria, and then starts thinking about how they can grow their enterprise even further, and they changed their name to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or sometimes known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS or ISIL. So they get their start actually in the insurgency against the American occupation of Iraq. And then you have a variety of other sectarian violence with various religious groups fighting one another. So again, phase 4, trying to restart this government, there's some things that they just didn't really plan on happening that they're now trying to deal with. In 2007, even though he thought that major combat operations were over, President Bush dramatically increased the troop presence in Iraq. So you can see that they kind of kept them fairly, steady overall. They tried to draw them down right after because they thought it was over. And then you see this spike again in 2007, and then you don't see a drawdown until kind of 2009. And we'll talk about what's happening here after George Bush's presidency as well. But President Bush stated that he wanted unified democratic federal Iraq that can govern itself, defend itself, and sustain itself, and is an ally in the war on terror. So he kind of like is demonstrating his goals, the speech that he made, but they start realizing that that's going to take a lot longer than what they originally thought. So from 2008 to 2011, violence declined as the new government took power. So a lot of foreign policy experts, military experts would say in general, the surge worked. Sending more troops in did help, and the government was able to kind of get off on a wobbly start. U.S. combat operations formally ended in Iraq in 2011. So one thing that Barack Obama, when he became president, he really wanted to do was get out of Iraq pretty much as soon as possible. He kind of wanted to wash his hands of this operation that maybe he didn't necessarily agree with. I can't remember what they go back and forth so many times about who voted for it and who didn't vote for it. But anyway, if he had voted for it in the beginning, he was definitely against it at this point. So looking at getting out of Iraq, there's a good PBS documentary called Losing Iraq, which talks about like the transition there and how it leads to ISIS eventually. I might put a link in the lesson plan for you. But anyway, they stopped combat operations in 2011, and no WMDs actually were ever found. They never. Some people say like, oh, it's Iraq. It's a giant country, there's a lot of desert, there's places they could have gone underground, but they've never actually found evidence that there were any weapons that Saddam Hussein was not supposed to have. And also, as can be expected, Iraq's oil reserves were divided amongst 5 Western energy companies to take control of the oil reserves, much to the chagrin of a lot of people who felt like that was, if you hear the line about how the Iraqi war was for corporate greed, this is generally what they're talking about. And then in 2014, you had the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria invading and securing multiple cities in Iraq, including Mosul, which was one of the major cities in Iraq. And that's where then the U.S. starts to get more militarily involved with not necessarily like the surge, but with airstrikes, special forces, training and advising the new Iraqi military. I remember 2014, this was a big deal. People were really worried about the threat. It took a couple of years, but for the most part, the Islamic State has lost most of its territory by this point, with still kind of conducting these kind of random attacks as well. Their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed, I think, geez, time flies, but I want to say last year, 2019. So why did all of this happen? If they didn't actually find any WMDs, like why did they go in and do this? So here are a couple of different theories, and you can take them with a grain of salt. They have varying different evidence to back them up. But one, obviously, if you think about the corporate greed line, was that they wanted access to Middle Eastern oil fields. Both President Bush and Vice President Cheney had ties to oil corporations. Iraqi oil reserves comprise 10% of the world's supply, so it definitely seems like there's an economic maybe incentive to doing this. Giant American corporations stood to make huge profits from the war and their aftermath. So weapons manufacturers like Boeing and Lockheed Martin received about $42 billion in Pentagon contracts in just 2002 alone. Another idea was that Iraq was a possible proving ground for the Pentagon's theories about how the U.S. could win future wars. So it kind of represents this idea that the Americans could win wars with fewer soldiers and using more technology. He went against so Rumsfeld, if you're not familiar, he was the Secretary of Defense during most of the Bush presidency, and then the Secretary of State was Colin Powell, and he was a very widely regarded general. And Powell had this idea that war should be limited and you should only go in if it's a last resort. And he had this very reserved idea of when the U.S. should engage in conflict. And Rumsfeld detested that idea, and he thought that the U.S. can do whatever it wants because we can use technology and win wars with fewer soldiers more quickly. So there's this idea that this was like a proving ground for that. The U.S. had always been able to use a territory in the Middle East to project power throughout the region. So Iran, until 1979, was with the Shah, and Saudi Arabia as well. The U.S. tries to align itself and project power through Saudi Arabia, and that this was like another opportunity to do that. Many key figures in the Bush administration were huge supporters of Israel. And so maybe people think that maybe that was to keep Israel strong in the Middle East, even though in general, to my knowledge, Iraq was not in the business of threatening Israel. But it's an idea. And then just the desire to spread liberty around the quote-unquote world. A lot of people there caught up after the September 11th terrorist attacks in fighting all people that were against American interests and were against democracy or what they saw as freedom. So just kind of caught up in that feeling of nationalism that came with the response to the September 11th attacks. So that's all well and good when you're fighting against a government that, like an actual government, but what happens if you're fighting against people or declaring war? The people you're declaring war against are not governing representatives of a nation, and that's where you kind of get into the war on terror, which the Iraqi war is kind of an offshoot of that, but it's more of a conventional style war than the war on terror where you're fighting non-state actors, and we'll get into that next. So that's kind of the big one of the two big foreign policy situations that's still affecting you today, and it's going to affect administrations to come, but that's how it kind of went, and some theories for U.S. involvement.